Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality-assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers, everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode to claim discounts and rewards on their website www.young.scot.
Doctors would diagnose diabetes mellitus by tasting the urine.
Imagine a time when a diagnosis of diabetes was akin to a death sentence. Prior to the groundbreaking discovery of insulin in the early 20th century, patients with type 1 diabetes faced a grim fate, wasting away and succumbing within months. Meanwhile, those with type 2 diabetes endured a lifetime of debilitating symptoms and complications. Although featured more in the higher human biology course than the higher biology course, given that here in Scotland we hold the unfortunate title of the second most obese country in the world, understanding blood glucose levels and obesity becomes paramount for us all. In this episode, we're privileged to be joined by two distinguished guests, Professors Brian Frier and Mark Strachan. Together, we'll delve into the history of diabetes treatments, shedding a light on how science has evolved to transform what was once a dire prognosis into a manageable condition. Professor Frier, welcome to the Higher Biology podcast.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name's Brian Frier. I'm a retired physician. I was a diabetologist for 30 years, both in Glasgow and in Edinburgh. And I'm currently an honorary professor in diabetes at the University of Edinburgh. So I've spent a lot of time with this particular specialty, although I don't profess to know everything about it.
It's fantastic to have you on the podcast, Professor Frier. What was your own favourite subject at school?
Well, my favourite subject was biology. Obviously, if you show an interest in medicine, then you're directed towards doing all the sciences. But I have to say that biology was the favourite. I quite enjoyed chemistry, but I was never very good at physics. So I liked the botany side and also the zoology part of biology. And I think that's what directed me towards medicine as a career.
And you've suddenly become a real favourite of the podcast. You wouldn't believe how many guests we've had on whose favourite subject was not biology.
Oh, so really?
Yeah, an amazing number of biologists and people that have done biology to an incredible level, and it wasn't their favourite subject at school. So that's great to know. You're obviously Professor Frier now, but how did young Brian sitting in a science class at school become Professor Frier? What was that journey?
Well, I mean, some people say that they always wanted to do medicine right from an early age, and they wanted to save the world, if you like. But I never had that attitude. I just found the whole thing interesting. There were no family members who were in medicine, and so I started it with an open mind, if you like. And it was a tough course. It's not an easy course, medicine. Particularly back in the days when I did it, when there was a lot of concentration on things like anatomy, which was heavy going. But as you got through the course and into the sort of junior medical part of the training, you don't know what you're going to do to start with. It's a very broad and wide field, medicine. There are many different avenues to take, and you veer towards things which take your interest. So I knew very early on I wasn't going to be a surgeon. I was much more interested in medicine and the physician side of things. And then you have to think about a particular special interest. So gradually I veered towards diabetes and endocrinology, and then you sort of take it from there. But it's quite a long training. You don't sort of become an expert overnight. It takes many years of experience and exams and various other aspects of the training before you become a specialist.
And as a diabetologist, of course, you'll be looking at diabetes. What can you tell us about diabetes and why is it a big deal?
Well, diabetes is not just one single disease state or disorder. It covers a whole range of different conditions. We'll get into some of that perhaps in a moment or two. But the unifying thing about them all is that they all cause a disruption in metabolism, and it causes blood glucose to go very high, and that has serious consequences. I think one of the other big attractions of diabetes is that it involves almost every system in the body. So, the diabetologists are really the sort of last of the general physicians. They have to know everything about every aspect, whether it's the cardiovascular system or the kidneys or the brain or the people's feet. You need to know about everything to some extent to be able to manage it properly. It's a very challenging condition to manage. It's not an easy one to manage. And of course, the reason why it's so important is it's vast numbers of people now globally have this condition. And because it has serious complications and side effects, it's causing a very major public health problem now, everywhere, not just in the UK, but all over the world.
I guess it might be fair to say that there's currently really a global explosion in diabetes then.
There is indeed. It's been particularly evident, say, in the last 20 years, where the numbers have taken off almost exponentially. Some parts of the world much more so than others. Europe and North America, they had their explosion some time ago, so the numbers there are not rising quite as rapidly. But in some of the less developed parts of the world, where they're now becoming more affluent and lifestyle is changing, such as, say, the Indian subcontinent, China, parts of Africa, the numbers are rushing out, going up in enormous numbers. The Middle East is another area where there's been an explosion in numbers and severity of the diabetes.
What about here in Scotland?
Well, Scotland is holding its own in terms of numbers. Interestingly, type 1 diabetes, which is the type which affects younger people, and although it affects all age groups, is much more common in Northern Europe than in the South. So Scotland has about the same numbers as the Scandinavian countries. But overall, the bulk of the diabetes is type 2 diabetes, which is not the same condition, a completely different disorder, although it has the same outcomes. Approximately 90% of people have type 2 diabetes, and about 10% have type 1 diabetes. Now, if you want absolute numbers, I think the last count in Scotland, there are about 300,000 people with diabetes. About 32,000 of these have type 1 diabetes. If you look at the UK as a whole, it's about 5 million people with diabetes. We're talking big numbers here. And that's a big challenge for healthcare resources. Men slightly more than women, too, interestingly. Men, but 56% of type 2 diabetes is male, 44% female.
And what's been driving that increase in the numbers, Professor Frier?
The big driver, I think, in type 2 diabetes is weight gain, obesity. Did you know that Scotland's got the second highest in the world in terms of obese people? I didn't know that until relatively recently. Then what's the top, of course, is the USA, but Scotland's well up there, and we've got a lot of very overweight children now, which is very worrying for the future. 1 in 5 children are classified as obese in Scotland, so that's a real worry.
And with that, I shall shortly head to the gym, I think.
Well, I'm not a gym enthusiast, so I've had to use the gym occasionally, but I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying a bit of regular exercise. Walking is probably the best thing, and get out in the fresh air. These are important. The other big drivers are things like advancing age. With an aging population, you get more diabetes. It's a type 2 diabetes I'm talking about. It's a condition of aging. And it's also common in the Southeast Asian population. They've got a lot more, 6 times, I think, is the prevalence in Southeast Asians than it is in the white Caucasian population. So there are a whole lot of factors which affect the incidence of this condition. But the big ones are obesity and age. Now, the other things, of course, important are lifestyle. We've become more and more sedentary in our lifestyle in recent years, and that isn't helping in terms of promoting diabetes. So there are a number of factors involved, but I hope that it sort of gives you an idea of what the major problems are.
You talk about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. What is the difference between them?
Just before I do that, I should also mention that although we know people who have diabetes, there's a lot who we don't know. There's about 1 million people, they reckon, in the UK have undiagnosed diabetes. So it's a sort of occult condition in many people. They don't have any symptoms, they don't complain of anything, they're overweight, so on, but they don't realize they have this condition, and it gets picked up in other ways, sometimes because they become unwell with something else and they're found to have a high sugar, or they present even with a complication of the diabetes. So sorry, I'll come back to your point though. You're asking about the difference between type 1 and type 2. Well, there are 2 different conditions. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder where the cells that make insulin in the pancreas are destroyed by an autoimmune process within the body, which is triggered by a number of things, possibly by an infection. And once that gets going, there's no way of stopping it. So it ends up destroying most, if not all, the cells that make insulin in the pancreas. The type 2 diabetes, by contrast, is a condition usually concerned with insulin resistance. So people are still making insulin, but the insulin isn't working as well. And that's part of the problem with obesity, because if people become overweight, insulin doesn't have the same benefit. So what happens is the pancreas then racks up its secretion. It tries to make more to counteract this problem, and eventually it gets exhausted and fails. That doesn't happen in everybody, of course. You have to have a genetic predisposition towards type 2 diabetes before this will happen. But there are really 2 quite distinct conditions. Problem, of course, is the longer people have type 2 diabetes, the more their insulin secretion fails, the more they become like type 1. And eventually, they're going to need insulin treatment or insulin therapy as replacement, as people do with type 1.
And obviously, you talk about it obviously being to do with regulating blood glucose. How do our bodies normally regulate blood glucose then?
Well, it's quite complicated. I'm not sure if I could give you the answer in 2 or 3 sentences. But one of the key hormones is insulin, and insulin is the major anabolic hormone. It's the one that it makes things, whereas many of the other hormones that we know about are catabolic. They break things down. So what insulin does is it regulates the level of glucose in the blood, which is very important for various reasons, but it's also important for the storage of fuel. So storage of glucose within muscles and storage in fat depots and regulation in how glucose is handled in the liver. This is one of the big roles of insulin. It promotes the uptake of glucose into cells, and you need glucose for energy. And it prevents the breakdown of fat and protein. So it helps to make things like muscles. So it's a very key hormone in the body, and we can't live without it. It's essential for life. So we remove insulin, everything goes haywire. And of course, that was why type 1 diabetes was a fatal disorder until insulin was discovered. So these are the main roles of insulin. How does it regulate it? Well, the main source of glucose is food, as we eat meals every day. But it can also be made from storage in the liver and storage in the kidneys. So glucose can enter the bloodstream different ways, and then it's utilized by most of the organs in the body, the key one being the brain. The brain consumes very large amounts of glucose. In its resting state, it'll consume, the body's at rest, the brain's consuming 80% of the glucose. So if you reduce the glucose the glucose going to the brain, it rapidly malfunctions. But also, of course, we need glucose into the muscles, and that includes the heart. It also is key for the metabolism of blood cells. So absolutely vital that this is regulated carefully. And one of the big things that insulin does is it keeps the blood glucose level within a very narrow range within the body. It doesn't go too high and doesn't go too low. So it's a very important hormone when it comes to regulating glucose metabolism. And you say, well, why is that important? Why do we have to keep it within this particular range? Well, that's so that the brain will function at its maximum capacity. And it's also maintaining an energy source for most tissues in the body. And it's looking after the health and integrity of blood vessels. So it's got a big role, key role.
So what happens then when things do go wrong?
If insulin is no longer available, it's not being made anymore, or it's not working effectively, then a lot of these processes that I mentioned are then reversed. And instead of storing glucose in the liver and pushing it into tissues where it's needed, the opposite happens. So the glucose starts to make new glucose that comes into the bloodstream. It breaks down in storage form, which is called glycogen. And you get the breakdown of fat. Fat's a big storage. It stores a lot of energy, fat. But without insulin there, it's broken down. And you get free fatty acids being released, which then get oxidized into the liver, and you then get the form of things called ketones. And ketones are an acidic type of chemicals, and they are particularly dangerous. So you get a buildup of ketones. So somebody with type 1 diabetes with no insulin can go into a condition called ketoacidosis, which is life-threatening. In people with type 2 diabetes, they can get very high glucose levels, and they get a non-ketotic form of metabolic derangement, which also can cause coma and is also potentially fatal. So, without insulin, there can be very serious consequences. Now, most people with type 2 diabetes don't go to that level. They are moderately deficient rather than severely deficient. So they get a reversal of some of these processes, and they get a much higher glucose than is normal. And a high glucose damages blood vessels. That's the problem in the long term. So that's what we're trying to avoid in diabetes and trying to treat it effectively.
What could the results of the damaged blood vessels be?
Well, this is what causes the complications of diabetes, and they're usually talked about in terms of small vessel disease, that's the very narrow capillary disease, and large vessel disease. The small vessel disease causes damage to the eyes with a form of diabetic eye disease. It can damage the kidneys. People can get kidney failure in the end. It also can damage the nerves, so they get neuropathies affecting their peripheries, their feet and hands. In fact, there's no organ that's exempt, really. It can affect the heart and the brain as well. There's small vessel disease affect both of these in diabetes. The big killer, though, is that it damages large blood vessels, which is called macrovascular disease. So we're talking now about the coronary blood vessels, the vessels up to the brain, the aorta, the big ones get damaged with a condition called atherosclerosis, which is it's a condition which gets commoner with advancing age, but it's accelerated in people with poorly controlled diabetes. So they start getting things like heart attacks and strokes and that at a much earlier or younger age, if it isn't treated. If we treat the diabetes effectively, we've got very, very good evidence now that a lot of these complications are either prevented or at least diminished. So this is why good control of diabetes is absolutely vital.
Which seems a really good time to bring in Professor Mark Strachan to guide us through the remarkable history of diabetes treatments.
Well, thank you. My name is Mark Strachan. I am a professor of diabetes and endocrinology at the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh. And as my job title implies, I see a lot of people with diabetes. And the history of diabetes is fascinating. What we're doing with diabetes now is amazing. And I think this might well be of interest to the students listening to your podcast.
Can you talk us through maybe a kind of working day as a consultant in diabetes and endocrinology? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so diabetes and endocrinology is predominantly what we call an outpatient speciality. So most people that I see in an outpatient clinic. So it's very similar to a GP surgery, except it's a specialist clinic in a hospital. And I do clinics for people with diabetes, and I do subspecialty clinics for people with diabetes. So one morning I might be doing a clinic for women with diabetes who are pregnant, or I might be doing a clinic for people with very rare genetic forms of diabetes. In an afternoon, I might be doing an endocrinology clinic where I see a whole panoply of different hormone disorders. So the hormone glands that I deal with are the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the parathyroid glands, and the pituitary gland, and of course as well the testes and the ovaries. So I will see adults, because I'm an adult physician, with conditions that affect one or more of these organs. There are actually two different types of diabetes: diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus, which is a very, very rare condition. Diabetes mellitus essentially means that the levels of glucose, sugar, in your blood are too high. That fundamentally is what diabetes mellitus is. The reason it's got the name mellitus is Latin for sweet. And in historic times, doctors would diagnose diabetes mellitus by tasting the urine, and it was sweet.
I can't imagine you do much of that anymore, Mark.
Well, believe you me, it has now never crossed my mind. So no, we never ever would do that. Horrendous. I thought those poor doctors of olden days. The condition diabetes insipidus is caused by a lack of the hormone, antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, from the pituitary gland. And in that condition, the urine wasn't sweet; it was insipid. Hence, diabetes insipidus. So, diabetes mellitus is high levels of sugar in the blood. One of the big misconceptions is that it's one condition. It's not. It's actually a whole range of different disorders that have an endpoint that is high levels of sugar in the blood. The commonest cause of diabetes in the UK is type 2 diabetes, which tends to occur in adults, particularly older adults, tends to occur in people who are overweight. And we don't really know ultimately what causes it, but fundamentally, your body produces insulin, but it just doesn't work properly. You have what we call insulin resistance. So the cells in your body just cannot respond to insulin in the normal way. The second most common cause of diabetes, but actually only about a tenth as common as type 2 diabetes, is type 1 diabetes. And that's the form of diabetes that is more common in younger people, or rather it develops in younger people. And in that condition, your body does not make enough insulin. Usually that in type 1 diabetes, that is a consequence of your body's immune system attacking the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, which are the cells that make insulin. And if, in effect, what we call the autoimmune process destroys the beta cell, and so you're no longer able to make enough insulin to meet the demands of the body. So in both those forms of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, you have effectively insulin deficiency. In type 1, it's an absolute deficiency of insulin. You're just not making enough. And in type 2, you're making lots of insulin, but it just can't work properly because of the resistance. And so functionally, you're insulin deficient.
And I guess before we kind of discovered things like insulin back in the kind of early 20th century, something like diabetes was pretty much essentially a death sentence. How did that discovery of insulin come about, and how did that revolutionise the treatment of diabetes?
Yeah, so the story of the discovery of insulin is genuinely one of the most incredible stories in medicine. It actually shows the best and the worst of humanity. There's no question about it. So the first thing to say was that before the discovery of insulin, there was no concept of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. The people did not understand that they were different conditions. Type 2 diabetes, although I say it's by far and away the most common cause of diabetes today, was actually very rare because people didn't live long enough. And of course, because of poverty and lack of ready access to food, they want the same levels of obesity that we have in society today. So type 2 diabetes was relatively rare. So the predominant form of diabetes was probably what we would now understand as type 1 diabetes. And you're right, it was a death sentence. If you developed type 1 diabetes in, say, 1910, your average life expectancy was about 9 months. It was, worse than most forms of cancer today. What was known at the time was that type 1 diabetes, as we understand it, or diabetes as they understood it then, had something to do with the pancreas gland. So that was known because if you did an operation on a mammal, say a dog, and removed the dog's pancreas gland, the dog would develop diabetes and would die shortly afterwards. It sounds very gruesome, that not very acceptable in today's standards, but that was how it came to be realized that the pancreas was the seat of diabetes. There'd been various attempts to try and work out what it was about the pancreas. Of course, it was known that the pancreas made digestive enzymes. So it made the enzymes like lipase and the proteinases that break down the food that we eat. That was well known. But what was speculated was that there was some what we call internal secretion that was made in the pancreas that went into the bloodstream, in contrast to the digestive enzymes which went externally into the gut, into the duodenum and the small bowel. At this point in time, we're talking now the early 1920s, there really were very few medical treatments as we would understand them. They were still giving salts of heavy metals like arsenic and mercury as treatments for medical disorders at this time. But thyroid extract was available to treat an underactive thyroid gland. And thyroid extract basically meant was you took a pig thyroid gland, mushed it up in a mortar and pestle, filtered out the solid matter, and injected it under the skin. That was the what they were doing. But actually, that worked. That was a very successful treatment for an underactive thyroid. And so the scientists, the doctors of the time thought, well, we could do the same with the pancreas gland. Let's grind it up, filter out the solid material, and inject it. But the problem was that when you did that, you got a supernatant, effectively, that yes, had likely, almost certainly had insulin in it, but of course it had all those horrible digestive enzymes in it as well. And so those digestive enzymes firstly broke down the insulin. So the extract didn't lower glucose levels. But potentially even worse than that, when you injected it under the skin, the digestive enzymes actually cause very nasty skin breakdown, because it effectively digested the skin and the fatty tissue under the skin. So all the early experiments with pancreatic extracts failed. But in Toronto, in 1921, there was a doctor there called Frederick Banting. He was actually a failed orthopedic surgeon. He wasn't a very good surgeon, if I'm honest. But he came up with actually what, in theory, was a very good idea. And his idea was that you could, if you operated on a dog and tied off in the operation the pancreatic duct, so that's the duct that all the digestive enzymes flow out of into the duodenum. If you tied that off and then stitched the dog back up again, left the dog for 7 or 8 weeks, the tying off of the pancreatic duct would cause a buildup of pressure in the duct that would then cause the cells that make the digestive enzymes to die off. So then if you went back 2 months later and operated on the dog and took out the pancreas, ground it up in the mortar and pestle, you would get an extract that was relatively free of digestive enzymes, but would contain this internal secretion that seemed to prevent diabetes. So that was his big idea. And so he went to the University of Toronto, and there was a professor of physiology there called John MacLeod. He was actually an Aberdonian, and he'd moved from Scotland to Canada. And to MacLeod's very great credit, he recognized that Banting had come up with a really good idea and gave him space in his laboratory. Now, today, if you went to a professor of physiology in a university as an untested scientist and said, "Oh, I've got this really good idea," you'd probably be booted out of the door in 2 seconds. But anyway, over the course of a very hot summer in Toronto, Banting and a student called Charles Best set about trying to do these experiments. And actually, the experiments didn't work very well. But they made slow progress. But the key thing was that they brought a chemist on board, a biochemist, who was able to, with a variety of solvent extractions, was able to separate out the internal secretion from the digestive enzymes. And so they managed to get now you wouldn't call it a pure extract. It was a brown, murky brown slush that they ultimately had. But when they tested it on a child who was dying of diabetes in the Toronto Children's Hospital in January 1922, the child's life was saved with this extract. and the child went on to live for some decades afterwards. So overnight, this was, it's hard to emphasize, Paul, how massive this was. Here was an actual true medical discovery that turned a fatal illness, an inevitably fatal illness, into one that you could live with. And it turned Banting and MacLeod overnight into sort of absolute media stars. People, you could imagine, rich families from North America were bringing their kids who were dying to the doors of the Toronto hospital to try and get this insulin, as it was now called. And it must have been a completely crazy time. Unfortunately, Banting and MacLeod fell out spectacularly and never spoke to each other again after the discovery. And they were awarded, I think it was in 1924, the Nobel Prize for Medicine, Physiology and Medicine. And that still remains to this day the quickest period of time between a medical discovery and the award of a Nobel Prize. Normally, as you all know, Nobel Prizes tend to be awarded 20, 30 years after the initial work has been done. 2 years passed between the discovery of insulin and the award of the Nobel Prize. And that's just a measure of what an blockbuster discovery this was.
And an amazing story that it was somebody that was failing in their field and turned an entire career around as well.
This shows there's hope for all of us.
There's hope for all of us, right enough. And do we know why they fell out?
Well, they fell out because Banting believed that the discovery of insulin was his discovery. He'd come up with this initial idea. Now, the reality, and he felt that MacLeod was trying to steal part of the credit for the discovery. Now, the reality is, without MacLeod giving Banting laboratory space and funds to do the research, Banting would never have got anywhere at all. And MacLeod was a true international authority in carbohydrate metabolism at the time. And the other reality is that actually Banting's idea ultimately didn't work. This tying off of the pancreatic duct, it didn't actually work very well. What made the difference was bringing in the biochemist, a man called James Collop, who was able to do these purification steps. But Banting had, if I'm honest, had no insight into this. He just thought this was his idea. He deserved all the credit for it. And that MacLeod was just this guy trying to muscle in on his discovery, which was not true at all. And I think in the present day, it is recognised that actually MacLeod was worthy of his share of the Nobel Prize.
We can add that to the list of things Scotland's achieved.
Absolutely. Well, it is actually one. There are very few Nobel Prizes in medicine that have gone to Scottish people, but MacLeod is one of them. And the medal for the Nobel Prize is still held by the University of Aberdeen to this day.
Wow. Banting, bit of a superstar. Not much for a team player, though.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Totally. You hit the nail on the head.
And obviously that was early 1920s.
Yes.
How then has our understanding of diabetes and its treatment then evolved since then?
Yeah, well, so it was thought then, if in the early 1920s, everybody then believed that this was it. Diabetes wasn't cured, because insulin doesn't cure you of diabetes. It's merely replacing what your body is no longer able to make in the case of type 1 diabetes. But people thought at the time that you would be able to live a normal life with type 1 diabetes. But the reality was very different from that, because what then happened was insulin kept you alive, but it did not return your blood glucose levels to normal. Far from it. In general, blood glucose levels were very high, but actually at times, blood glucose levels could also fall very, very low, at what we call hypoglycemia. Now, as you know, the brain is absolutely dependent on glucose as a metabolic fuel. It is the prime fuel for the neurons in the brain. The brain doesn't have stores of energy on hand. There's no glycogen stored in the brain. And so the brain is entirely dependent on the blood supply of the supply of glucose in the blood to the neurons. And if the glucose levels in your blood fall to too low a level, then effectively your brain starts to fail. You become muddled, you become confused, you're not thinking clearly, and ultimately you will pass into a coma, you'll have epileptic seizures, and you will die if your blood glucose is not restored to a normal level. So hypoglycemia is a very, very serious complication of insulin therapy. So what in effect happened in the next few decades was that people were living with diabetes in general with very high blood sugars most of the time, but then suddenly, potentially unpredictably, their sugar levels would crash down and they could be rendered unconscious. Terrible to have to live with that possibility. If you have high blood sugar levels for prolonged periods, that in turn causes very serious damage to the small blood vessels, the arterioles in particular, of tissues. And so what emerged over the next 20 or 30 years were what we now term as advanced microvascular complications of diabetes. So people started developing changes in their kidney, in the blood vessels in their kidneys, that led to kidney failure and death from kidney disease, or in later years, a requirement for kidney dialysis. People started developing changes in the backs of their eyes that led to bleeding in the backs of the eyes and blindness. People started having a much increased frequency of heart attacks and strokes. People started developing nerve damage in their feet that led to amputations. These things had never been seen before because people died within those first few months of a diagnosis of diabetes. But what emerged in the decades that followed were these advanced complications of diabetes. And it was simply a consequence that insulin could not mimic the injections of insulin could not mimic the natural physiology. In humans, in health, we have this absolutely beautiful system whereby the release of insulin is inextricably linked to the levels of glucose in the blood. So if your blood sugar levels go high, your pancreas releases more insulin into the portal circulation, into the hepatic portal vein, to the liver, then into the systemic circulation. And more crucially, if your sugar levels start to dip down low into this hypoglycemia range, the production of insulin is switched off. And so what that means is that in health, glucose levels are maintained within a very narrow band. But in in type 1 diabetes, typically, exogenous insulin, injection of insulin, they just can't do that. There's not that link to endogenous insulin. Once you've given yourself a bolus of insulin by injection, that insulin is in your body working, come what may, irrespective of what your blood glucose level is. So you lose that physiological link between glucose and insulin action. And so, as I say, as a consequence, people lived often with very high sugars and then these sudden crashes in sugars. And so, yes, insulin saved lives, but unfortunately, it wasn't good enough largely to prevent complications of diabetes, both in terms of damage to blood vessels and these crashes in sugar levels. What happened between sort of 1923 and predominantly the sort of 1980s was that there were what I would call incremental improvements in insulin. So the initial insulins that were produced were all derived from animals. So the pharmaceutical companies could go to abattoirs and get large volumes of pancreas glands from pigs and from cows, and they would extract the insulin from that. So we had what was called porcine and bovine insulin, and they were the mainstays of insulin therapy until the 1980s. Modifications in turn were made to those insulins, primarily with the addition of chemicals that slowed the action of the insulin, so that it lasted, one injection would last longer in your body than the native insulin molecule. And then in the 1980s, we started to get the introduction of human insulins. Now, these weren't human pancreas glands that were being ground up. These were this used recombinant DNA technology. So effectively, segments of DNA that had the sequence for human insulin, essentially the insulin gene, were transfected into E. coli bacteria being grown in large Petri dishes. And those E. coli then produced insulin, human sequence insulin, released it into the Petri dishes, and that again could be harvested, and that created effectively a supply of what we call human insulin, but what we really mean was human sequence insulin. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, we started having the ability to manipulate the insulin molecule itself. So no longer human sequence, precise human sequence insulin. The scientists were able to modify it so that they changed amino acids within the insulin molecule, and that again changed the pharmacokinetics of that insulin molecule. So the insulin could be made to last for an ultra short period of time to mimic the sort of pulses of insulin that you get when you eat a meal, or it could be used to really extend the duration of the action of insulin to mimic the sort of what we call the basal secretion of insulin that happens when you're, for example, asleep in bed overnight. So these were really impressive developments, incredible science that allowed these developments in the insulin molecule, but they still cannot match the physiology of the of the normal human pancreas, the normal human beta cell.
That's quite incredible, and of course those producing that insulin in petri dishes was very quickly ramped up to produce it in huge industrial vats.
Exactly, that's exactly right. So you have industrial scale production of insulin, and that, of course, that's one of the consequences of that is that we tend to think of diabetes and how it affects people in the United Kingdom, but of course, diabetes is a worldwide condition, and it affects people in the poorest countries in the world, where cost of drugs often limits access to them. So one of the huge advantages of industrial scale production of human sequence insulin was that it could be made available relatively cheaply to very poor countries, for example, in Africa and in parts of Asia. So, again, that's one of the huge advances and benefits of this industrial scale production.
Obviously, the development of insulin and the use of genetic engineering has been huge. How has technology been used to further improve outcomes then for patients with diabetes now that we have this ability to manipulate the insulin?
Yeah, so this, type 1 diabetes now is going through a real technological revolution. So what I've described up till now has been the scientific breakthroughs manipulating the insulin molecule. But as I said earlier, the problem is that it's not linked to your glucose levels. And that is the fundamental problem. Now, traditionally, insulin has been given as a subcutaneous injection using a pen device. And actually, that was invented in Scotland, in Glasgow.
Another one.
Yeah. So a Dr. Ireland, who was a diabetes consultant in Glasgow, in conjunction with Dr. Sheila Reith, who I had the immense privilege of working with, who was a consultant at Stirling Royal Infirmary, came up with the idea of insulin pen devices. So you may have seen these. Essentially, they look like a big fountain pen. They have a cartridge in them that's got insulin. You can screw on a very fine needle at the end, and they've got a dial-up device that allows you to dial up the dose of insulin. So Sheila Reith came up with the initial idea because she had a daughter with diabetes. So this is something she's spoken very publicly about. I'm not betraying any confidence. And in the 1970s, in the early 1980s, she was used to having to go into a toilet, public toilet, with her daughter if she was out and about, having to take a vial of insulin and an old-fashioned syringe, try and draw it up in the toilet, and then inject it into her daughter. And she thought, wouldn't it be much easier if everything was contained in one device? And she approached Dr. Ireland in Glasgow. So they came up with a prototype and then took it to a pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk, and that led to the development of the insulin pen, which revolutionized the delivery of insulin. With pens, you're effectively giving a bolus injection. And most people with type 1 diabetes using pens will take maybe 4 injections a day. An injection of a quick-acting insulin with each meal, and then a 4th injection of a long-acting insulin. Sometimes they may take 2 injections a day of the long-acting insulin. But in the 1980s, but really it became ramped up in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we started to use what are called insulin pump devices to deliver insulin. So an insulin pump is basically, it's the size of a small mobile phone. And And it's essentially just like a syringe driver. It's a cartridge of insulin with a syringe head on it that is attached to a pump device. And then you connect that to your body with a little plastic tube, a little fine needle that goes in under the skin, although you take the needle out and it leaves just a little plastic, very fine plastic cannula sitting in under the skin. Now, the beauty of an insulin pump is that it only has quick-acting insulin in it, but it just drips it in, drip, 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 drip. And that mimics your background insulin. And then at meal times, you can press a button that gives you a larger bolus of insulin that mimics a mealtime surge. That is a much more flexible way of giving insulin. So rather than giving these big boluses that once they're in, you can never get them back out, the ability to drip in, particularly the background insulin, allows you to vary it with time. And that reduced some of this variability, the highs and the lows that I mentioned earlier in sugar level. But again, it's not coupled to your glucose levels, your blood glucose levels. But about, it must be about 7 or 8 years ago now, we started to get coming online continuous glucose monitors. So up and before then, people with type 1 diabetes, in order to measure their glucose levels, had to prick their finger, get a drop of blood, put it on a test strip into a small handheld meter, and that gave you a blood glucose level within about 10, 15 seconds. But blood glucose varies so much, second to second, our blood glucose levels vary. So the problem with finger prick blood glucose testing is that it only tells you what your glucose level is at that time. In 15 minutes' time, your blood glucose might be entirely different if you've, for example, drunk a can of Coke or Iron Brew or had a Snickers bar or something like that. So blood glucose testing was a revolution when it came in, but it had major limitations. The continuous glucose monitors, as their name implies, monitor your glucose levels across a full 24-hour period. Effectively, you wear a sensor on your arm that, again, you put in with a needle, very fine needle, which you remove, and it just leaves this tiny little plastic cannula under the skin. And the sensor usually lasts about 2 weeks. So it just sits on the surface of your skin with a little fine plastic cannula going under the skin, and it just monitors your glucose levels constantly. Again, that was revolutionary, allowing people to see what their glucose levels were without having to prick their finger. That was life-transforming. But crucially, these devices, you could have alarms built in so that if your sugar was dripping down into that very low danger level of hypoglycemia, the system would alarm and it would tell you that you're going low, so you could do something about it. But what these systems didn't do was that they didn't talk to your insulin pump. But in the last few years, that's been the big breakthrough, that with Bluetooth technology, these glucose sensors now can talk to the insulin pump. And so you're creating now what we call effectively, we call it, it's called this colloquially, it's not really true, but it gives you the sense, it's called an artificial pancreas system, APS. And effectively, these systems now, the pump now knows what your sugar level is. It's got various high-tech algorithms way beyond my knowledge to know how these algorithms work. But what these algorithms do is that they basically then mean that the pump, if it even predicts that it's not even waiting, for example, for your sugar to go low. If it predicts that your sugars are going to go low, the pump will give you less insulin. If it sees your sugars going high, it will give you more insulin. Now, again, these systems are not perfect at the moment, but my goodness me, they are light years away from what Banting and MacLeod discovered in 1922. I mean, these artificial pancreas systems are life transforming for people with type 1 diabetes. Absolutely life transforming, because they mean that you don't suffer necessarily from the chronic high levels of sugar, and this tendency for you to go low is dramatically reduced. So I've known many people, going to bed at night. If you imagine you live on your own with type 1 diabetes, that you're going to bed at night thinking, "Gosh, my sugar goes low overnight." I might not know that I'm going low, and who's going to help me out here and get me out of this low sugar level? So you have this fear of going low, which in itself causes you to artificially keep your sugar levels high. So you're not having lows. So these systems dramatically reduce the frequency of hypoglycemia. So they improve people's quality of life as a consequence. And because they're improving your overall average sugar, avoiding this chronic hyperglycemia, your risk of these advanced complications, your risk of going blind with diabetes, your risk of getting kidney failure or losing a leg, it's virtually abolished. So the benefits for the individual are massive. The benefits for the NHS in Scotland are, again, astonishing, because looking after somebody who's got kidney failure or who's blind is, in economic terms, very, very expensive. But we have a problem with these artificial pancreas systems, and that problem is that they in themselves are very expensive. So I live in Edinburgh, and we've calculated that we have about 5,000 people with type 1 diabetes who live in Lothian region. We've calculated that to get 90% of people with type 1 diabetes on one of these artificial pancreas systems at their current cost will probably cost the NHS in Lothian about £20 million a year.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. But actually, if you look at the cost of treating the complications of diabetes, it's very, very, very cost effective. Because treating these complications is extraordinarily expensive. But the problem that we have is that these artificial pancreas systems are incredibly cost effective, but they're cost effective over a 20-year period. And the way that funding works in the health service, it doesn't look 20 years ahead. It's looking at the here and now. And this is one of the challenges, the big challenges that we have, is to get these technologies funded so that we have got equal access for everyone with type 1 diabetes who wants it and who would benefit from it.
It just strikes me that we've come such a long way in really 100 years. Yeah. And in fact, within that, even over the last 20 years, there's been such huge advancements. If you had a crystal ball, where do you see treatments evolving in the years to come? And obviously, reducing the cost and making them more readily available will be a big part of that. But what else?
Yeah. So you're right. The cost of these systems will come down, and these systems will get better. They say they're far from perfect at the moment. They're really good, but they're not perfect. In the short term, scientists are developing what's called a bihormonal insulin pump. So the insulin pumps at the moment with the artificial pancreas systems have got just insulin in them. But in the bihormonal pumps that are being developed, they have two syringe drivers, one with insulin in it and the other with glucagon in it. Now, glucagon, as you'll know and as your students will know, is like the mirror image of insulin. Glucagon is made in the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, and insulin lowers your blood sugar levels. Glucagon raises your blood sugar levels. So actually, the way our pancreas works in health, it's a bit like driving a car, not that either of us would ever do this, with one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. So you're all the time, there's a state of flux between insulin and glucagon. You're giving a little bit more insulin, a little bit less glucagon. If your sugars are going high, if your sugars are going low, you're giving a bit more glucagon, a bit less insulin. That's what happens in health. And so that's what's being developed now. These systems will have both glucagon and insulin. And so they will try and mimic what's happening in the pancreas gland. So that will be likely the next evolution in artificial pancreas technology. I think if I was to project forward 10 or 20 years, then we're thinking about trying to either prevent diabetes, type 1 diabetes, or trying to cure it. Now, prevention is probably going to be around using drugs that block this autoimmune process that causes the destruction of the islet cells. Now, part of the problem there is that by the time somebody presents with type 1 diabetes, you've probably lost about 95% of your beta cells. That's how much redundancy there actually is in the pancreas gland. So it's not quite too late, but it's pretty late in the whole process. So there are trials going on at the moment now. These are very early trials using agents that block specific aspects of the immune system to try and switch off this autoimmune destruction process in the pancreas gland to try and preserve these 5 to 10% of beta cells that are still there. And the sort of holy grail is getting better ways of identifying people who have effectively pre-type 1 diabetes when they've maybe got 20 or 30% of their beta cells still there, so that you can give one of these agents to maintain that level of beta cell mass and hopefully prevent full-blown diabetes developing. In terms of curing existing diabetes, probably the best prospect for that going forward will be some form of islet cell transplantation. That is available at the moment. It's available in Scotland. Edinburgh is the National Centre for Islet Cell Transplantation. So effectively what happens in islet cell transplantation is that the pancreas gland of someone who has died, a human who has died, is taken and it is broken down in a laboratory, not too dissimilar to what Banting and Best were trying to do. And you extract the islet cells, the beta cells that, it's the islet cells themselves, the islets of Langerhans, from the pancreas, and you inject them into the liver, so that they embed in the liver and start making insulin and glucagon. The problem is, because it's a transplant, because you're receiving it from someone else, your body tries to reject that. So you have to take anti-rejection medication. That's got potential side effects. And the problem at the moment is that these anti-rejection medications can't prevent the body completely rejecting the beta cells. So what tends to happen is that as time goes on, the islets that have been transplanted, they stop working. For whatever reason, whether it's rejection, whether it's lack of blood supply, they just stop working. So the transplant doesn't last very long. So what people are trying to do, obviously, is first of all develop a way of having islet cells that the body doesn't reject. So perhaps taking maybe not human islet cells because they're in short supply, but taking an animal's islet cells, say a pig, modifying them genetically in some way so that they're not rejected, and then injecting them in. And then you could potentially then, if they did fail with time, you could give another top-up injection of them at a later date. Or these islets might be grown artificially in cell cultures. So I can sort of see that as a sort of holy grail in the future. But the trouble is, if you'd asked me 20 years ago where I thought we would be now, I think a lot of people thought we might be there now with islet cells, and we're not. So 20 years again may be too soon. That's why ultimately the old adage, prevention is better than cure. So if we can have these therapies that prevent the autoimmune destruction at the beginning, that is always going to be better than trying to do something like islet cell transplantation, which is essentially trying to patch up the damage that's already happened.
It's obviously a hugely exciting field with so much more still to come. Yeah. What advice, I guess, would you have then for young people considering a career in medicine within endocrinology or indeed the wider health service?
Well, I would absolutely say go for it. You see a lot of bad press about the NHS, and you'll have seen that unfortunately some of our junior doctors are taking industrial action at the moment around their pay and their working conditions. But medicine is still an incredibly exciting field to work in. The thing that I always say, the beauty of medicine as a career is that there are so many different avenues that you can go down, ranging from general practice to diabetes and endocrinology to transplant surgery to caring for older people to caring for children to caring for pregnant women to working in a laboratory to doing public health, vaccination. There is a huge variety that's open to you, and so I've loved. You could never say every minute because, of course, there are always challenges. But I've loved the overwhelming majority of my time as a doctor. It's been a very, very, as I come towards the end of my career, it's been a very, very rewarding career. And I've never for a millisecond regretted choosing medicine as a career. So if people are considering doing it, then absolutely I would say go for it. Of course, historically, we would always say, try and get some work experience. Try and see if you can spend some time in a hospital or a GP surgery, shadowing doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals. Obviously, with COVID, that's been a bit harder. Well, in fact, it's been almost impossible to get in recent times. But I think things are opening up now in that regard. But yeah, it still is a very, very good career to choose. Almost as good as teaching.
Almost. And we've had our own industrial action as well. So
yes, exactly.
it's across the board.
Exactly.
Professor Strachan, thank you very, very much for coming on the Higher Biology podcast.
Not at all. My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
You can find information on how to reduce your risk of developing diabetes on the NHS website. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice so that future episodes make their way directly to you.